All right. Thank you very much all for being here in the present with me now on Monday at noon. And for those of you watching in the future, hello, hello. And if you're watching in the past, don't know how that works, but welcome all the same. Today we're talking about a little bit of the history of how we landed in the current racial economic landscape. So a lot of what today's resources were would have been potentially familiar to many of you, but I wanted us to start with a little bit of the foundational historical moments because especially now, they're often erased, downplayed, and I thought it was best to start us all on the same kind of page with how we got to where we are today. Again, you're welcome to participate in your voice, participate in the chat, or send me an email or questions after the fact. For our plan today, there we go. For our plan today, I'm going to talk a little bit about the week to come, the Allyship Institute. We'll be talking a little about the foundations of inequity, some of the historical events that I mentioned a little bit earlier, a little bit about erasure and blame in terms of how we blame the victims of systemic oppression for their own condition. And then we'll close with a little bit of an allyship challenge, both for those of you who are here and those of you who are watching after the fact. I wanted to kick off with a quote from one of my all-time favorite activists, Baird Rustin, who says that racial justice is impossible without a new economy. So as you know, this year's Allyship Institute is focusing on the intersections of race and racism and classism. If you'd like to take a peek ahead at the whole schedule, please feel free to use the QR code there or go to our website, ywcamclean.org/allyship, and you are able to read ahead if you'd like to, or just kind of get a sense of what's to come. So today and Wednesday, we'll be having live sessions at noon, and the rest of the experience is really challenge by choice at your own pace. So if you're new to the model, we have the opportunity to partake in a menu of options. So there's always going to be something you can listen to, something you can read, and something you can watch, just so that whatever your learning style or preference, you have something you can engage in. I welcome the sharing of other resources. That's been one of my favorite parts about other allyship institutes, when y'all bring me magical gems that I get to share with the group. And I genuinely welcome feedback as well. So please don't hesitate to reach out. Because we are in 2025, I wanted to be a little bit timely or topical, I can say, about how we're discussing race and economy. So we know that the middle class has been shrinking over the last couple of decades, and we know that eggs cost, what, like $500 an egg, something like that. And so we know that we're pinched for pennies, and we're also in a landscape where identity politics or identity targeting is very du jour. It's very popular. So tomorrow we'll kick off how different presidents across the aisle have orchestrated what I call campaigns of division, particularly along the lines of race and class. And then Wednesday, we'll be joining in an interactive session on how we challenge the narrative. So how do we take where we are today in terms of economic disparities between Black folks and non-Black folks, and how do we talk about it from a strengths-based perspective, an asset-based perspective that doesn't make us feel like that's just the way things are. On Thursday, we'll be talking about why we do and don't talk about race, with a little bit of a shout out to current discourse on colorblindness and the poltergeist that is DEI. And then on Friday, we're going to close with how we move forward, take what we've learned, and then participate in, again, that allyship challenge that I mentioned. So let's kick it back to the very, very beginning. Since coming to the United States, I've learned that different states teach history very, very differently. And to me, that's a very big paradigm shift in terms of how we discuss who we are as a country, right? You can imagine that our sense of American self varies greatly depending on what you're told about how America was made. So I wanted to share with y'all, because this often gets erased as too long ago to matter, hint, hint, it's not, that there were 12.5 million African people who were kidnapped and then sold into slavery between 1525 and 1866. I've studied American history from an international perspective and a US perspective, but I've never seen the number before. You can kind of condense history as you move forward through time. So the same way we talk about like the Middle Ages, even though that's hundreds of years, we sort of condense it into like one paragraph in a textbook. As we move further and further in time away from historical events such as slavery, we can look at that subjugation as just sort of a blip. And we don't appreciate the magnitude of what 12.5 million people are. That is several New York cities, right? if we think about how many folks. More alarmingly so, a statistic that I didn't know until prepping for this was that only 10.7 million people survived the 2 month journey to come to the New World or the United States. So that's about 2 million folks who died on their journey, the unwilling journey of being sold into slavery and bondage here. So, in addition to chattel slavery, rather as a result of chattel slavery, excuse me, there's been the foundations of deep, deep, deep economic inequality. We've heard a lot about the conversation of reparations, where Black folks today still rightfully claim that there's a need for reparations to make up for the wrongdoings of the past. Not so fun fact that I really always want to share is that reparations were indeed paid out, but to slave owners and not to the formerly enslaved. This is true both in the United Kingdom and in the United States. So we are part of an economy that did feel there was a legal right or legal claim to reparations for lost funds, but only for white folks. That's not something that's ever been seen for the Black communities. And that's a theme that is harrowingly present in the history since then when we think about how economic disparities land across racial lines. So when we think about the 10.7 million enslaved Africans and African Americans who were thus born into bondage whilst in the United States, they earned about $1.4 trillion, which would be about $4.7 trillion in modern money that went entirely to white folks. I encourage you to imagine what the United States would look like if enslaved Africans and the descendants thereof were allowed, if not encouraged, or just able to keep even a fraction of those trillions of dollars. But we saw instead the subjugation of one group to profit the well-being and the thriving of another group. And throughout time, we've seen those dynamics kind of stay eerily the same, which leads us to incorrect thinking of this as how it is. That's tradition. That's just the status quo. We don't think about the cruelty and decision making that led us there. And so I wanted to emphasize this money fact here because money grows over time. And lack of money also grows. Again, why we're seeing such a chasm between the classes and such a chasm between different populations' wealth income. I also wanted to talk about racialized poverty. So even post-slavery, a thing that folks who disagree with this entire presentation might say was too long ago to matter again. There was something called the Black Codes that still monitored and legally decided what Black folks could and could not do. So this was called the Black Codes, kind of a predecessor to Jim Crow, if you will, where even though Black folks were free in the South and in the North as well, there was a legal code that stated no person of color can be an artisan, mechanic, or shopkeeper, or pursue any other trade or business besides farming, manual labor, or domestic service. So even in a time that the history books tell us was one of freedom and opportunity, it was called the Reformation. It was about transforming, hurt into success, giving folks back their agency. It was a limited agency they got because folks weren't allowed to build businesses. Folks weren't allowed to be artisans or use their countless skills to thrive economically. So that's why we see, if you're a fan of old TCM movies like I am, all the Black characters are in roles of servitude or domestic help or farming or sort of manual labor, blue collar jobs because they were banned or prohibited from doing any other kind of work. An exception to this was Black Wall Street, which I want to share a little bit about a little bit later. When we think about how the Black Codes turned into Jim Crow, of course, it's heinous policing of human rights, civil rights, and personal agency, but there's an economic impact that I think is often overshadowed when we talk about the past. So the GI Bill was right after World War II, so in the 1940s. The president at the time wanted to honor the veterans who gave their all for the country and fought the Nazis and won. So the GI Bill came about to offer finances, support, and help getting veterans on their feet so that they could contribute to America in like the idealized 1950s world that we know came after. Idealized in scare quotes, of course. So there was a Southern politician named Rankin. He was a Democrat at the time, and he was heinously racist. He was instrumental to ensuring that the GI Bill lacked federal oversight. So this fella in the South thought, okay, all these Black folks are coming back from World War II. This is really bad for our image of Black subjugation. These Black veterans will gain public sympathy because they fought on our side in the war. And with the GI Bill, they might gain financial agency. And Rankin said, we cannot have that. So he petitioned the government that states would be responsible for dispersing the funds of the GI Bill. That way, he and fellow racist politicians, call them what they are, could ensure oversight and deny Black veterans the same funds they offered to white veterans. So, because of a lack of federal oversight and empowering states to make their own decisions, you can tell what I'm alluding to in the present day and age, racism had the opportunity to creep right on in and take over the entire process. Because of Rankin's decision and his power in swaying the federal government to release the funds to the states, Black veterans were denied or 1.2 Black veterans were denied access to over 4.3 million home loans. That's a total of about $33 billion. So one racist fella got all his mates in the South and denied $33 billion worth of money to the Black community. So remember from my previous slide, we talked about $1.2 trillion. Now we're talking about another $33 billion. You can see how the foundations of economic disparity are swimming right along. On top of that, not only was there the deliberate and intentional and structural denying of finances and economic independence to Black communities, the 1950s brought with it the decimation of Black communities. So, in the Federal Aid Highway Act of 1956, this was the biggest infrastructure move that the country had made so far at that time, right? Since then, we've done a little bit more, but this was the biggest investment the government made in its own infrastructure in 1956, the year of Morocco's independence. Fun fact. The government decided we need highways so that we can connect our cities, so that we can be a thriving, well-connected country, keep it all kinds of great, if you will. When the infrastructure was being planned, when the city planners, urban designers all came together and decided where can we put these highways, they almost exclusively chose urban areas, which is a euphemism for Black neighborhoods, to divide with highways in the image you can see towards the right over here. This decision to put highways almost exclusively through Black neighborhoods impacted almost 500,000 households and more than 1 million people who were thus displaced. Not just inconvenienced, but fully displaced. So you can imagine a tight-knit community being fractured by a road that you probably can't safely cross, decimated what small communities were able to thrive and support themselves. So again, the continuing legacy of intentional decision-making that either denied Black folks funds or took away what little wealth and agency they had. And that leads us to modern day iteration of disenfranchisement, which is mass incarceration. We know that though Black folks only make between 13 and 15% of the US population, they are over half the prison population. And we talk about how that decimates families, ruins lives, absolutely all of that, how it leads to horrible social stereotyping. But one of the things that I've seen less discussed is the economic impact of mass incarceration, even for folks who only receive misdemeanors. So Black folks who experience incarceration miss out on between $360,000 to $500,000 of earned income through their lives, $500,000, as compared to other Black folks. When it comes to white folks, they really only lose, of course, about $200,000 compared to the potentially double amount that Black folks lose. And as I mentioned, even a conviction of something like shoplifting can impact earnings by up to 16% loss for everybody who receives a misdemeanor. So when we think about mass incarceration, of course, we need to honor the fact that Black folks are sentenced for longer, harsher sentences than their white peers. They are imprisoned at multiple times the rate that white folks and other non-Black folks are imprisoned. But it's also the smaller charges that we don't necessarily think of. Those don't fit into the felony box that still impact earnings and serve to almost justify the incorrect, egregious stereotypes that non-Black folks have about Black folks and their capacity to earn with dignity. So it all kind of feeds into it. So as you see the puzzle pieces that I'm laying together through time, you can see how at every stage there's been economic violence done to the Black community. And this is the foundational inequity that I wanted to bring up today. I realized we always start the Allyship Institute real depressing, and then I promise we, get more forward thinking, but we have to have an understanding of these foundations in order to move ahead. Oftentimes, folks do not consider the last like six historical examples and present day examples that I gave, because again, the further we move throughout time, the more we condense history. You remember probably learning about ancient Rome, ancient Greece when you were a kid in school, and like you had a couple of chapters, but those chapters were really only about Alexander the Great, maybe Nero, that chap named Caligula, where an entire empire was known by like three or four people. In more recent history, we see the same thing happening. We know about Malcolm X and MLK. We don't know about other civil rights leaders as much because we condense history, want to get the highlights for folks. But in a white run education system, those highlights often don't include missteps, whether intentional or unintentional, that white folks enacted that deeply, deeply impact Black communities and leave them at an economic disadvantage. As we think about the allyship challenge that I'm going to offer in a little bit, I want us to be aware of one of the pitfalls of allyship, which is playing the Oppression Olympics. For those of you who've not heard of the Oppression Olympics, it's not actually a sporting event. It's a tactic that is used to erase historical and present day oppressions in a game of comparisons. Apologize for the typo. So the idea of slavery was so long ago, let's actually talk about anti-Muslim hate today because it's more pressing, it's happening now. We could have that game of which is worse, but in us bickering over which is worse, we don't acknowledge that both are really awful and both are impacting communities of color. And we forget where the power lies, right? We forget about our ability to change both because we become very myopic in our own respective causes. This fractures community, reduces empathy and understanding, because instead of our ability to find solidarity and like, yes, Latinx cultures were absolutely disenfranchised, as were Black cultures, instead of us thinking, hey, everybody was disenfranchised by white leadership at the time, we think, oh, but I was more disenfranchised, and we like cut off the opportunity for empathy. And again, as you can see, this has happened over like 400 years and continues to happen. We're at a time where history is being rewritten, if not entirely erased. And so I wanted us to look at a couple of core examples of how the Black codes came into effect, what the language was. And I encourage you, you can join in the chat or just have a little moment of reflection. What this is familiar, what this is familiar to, that was almost an English sentence. What this reminds you of, all right? So this was a pamphlet written by the United Daughters of the Confederacy, an organization that is still going strong. This was written in 1919, and I want you to see what it reminds you of, because it outlines a curriculum that advanced the lost cause narrative, i.e. that of the Confederacy, and upheld white supremacy. So this was the United Daughters of the Confederacy, saying what could and could not be taught in their schools. They argued that you should reject a book that speaks of the Constitution other than a compact between sovereign states, so states' power over federal power. Reject a textbook that does not give the principles for which the South fought. So textbooks have to say, why did the South fight? It's about principles, not about slavery, states' rights. Reject the book that calls the Confederate soldier a traitor or the war a rebellion. We can think about more recent rebellions that are being sort of changed, rewritten, not treasonous anymore, but if we rewrite it as they were the heroes of a lost cause, that leaves a different impact on how we view our history and our own identity. Reject a book that speaks of the slaveholder of the South as cruel and unjust to his slaves. Let that one sit for its own. Reject a textbook that glorifies Abraham Lincoln, vilifies Jefferson Davis, omits to tell the stories of the South's heroes, and admits, excuse me, and then only focuses on the North's heroes. I'm reading through this and there are far more lines in it, but I wanted to focus on some of the core ones. And in the chat, for those of you who can't see it in the recording, it reminds someone of the Heritage Foundation's Project 2025. Absolutely. So we're seeing the erasure of history then and now. And this was a haunting part of the training to prepare for. In the chat as well, I appreciate the nod to January 6th was a tour through the Capitol, a gathering of true patriots is how we are now hearing about the January 6th riots spoken about, right? Just a tour, just casual, super calm. And we're, again, living through essentially 1919, where we're seeing the rewrites come in. and we are aware of the past, but it can be intensely gaslighting. And you can imagine for younger generations who don't have the lived memory, what you're told as a kid in a textbook, you believe to be true, right? So textbooks today. This happened before 2025. I always want to encourage that. This happened before 2016 as well. Oh my gosh. In the chat, somebody mentioned January 6th being a day of love. So let's go back to 2021. Over 300 books by Black authors were banned. 300 books. And in 2022, 30 state legislatures across the country introduced bills to limit the discussion of racial history. This was part of the fear mongering after critical race theory. If you have critical race theory questions, I'm your girl. I got you. There's also on the YWCA YouTube page a brief explainer video about that. So we're seeing historical tactics used to erase history. And we're seeing that as recently as a couple of weeks ago in terms of erasing the entirety of what it is to be Black. In the chat, we have someone stating it reminds them of the laws in Russia and how they try to rewrite the history of Ukraine to justify the war. It's illegal in Russia to even discuss the war, including Russian-occupied areas of Ukraine. I really appreciate you sharing that. Something I did not know, but makes sense when you think about how we structure the mythos of our country in a way that we have to believe in, or that leadership wants to believe in. Because a country with a history of shame doesn't inspire pride, right? So how is that being rewritten to justify where we are today? I want to talk briefly about the Tulsa Race Massacre in 1921. So post-slavery, free Black folks created their own community, their own banks. They had a thriving economy in Tulsa that was called Little Africa. So the Tulsa race riots were a response to this. This was a neighborhood, as you'll see from some of the resources today, where Black folks lived independently of white oppression. It was kind of a Wakanda in the United States, very much utopian in its descriptions. There's still, I believe, at least one survivor who lived through the race riots and the massacre. She was a child at the time, who remembers what it was like seeing an entirely Black community thrive, release the literal and proverbial shackles of slavery, and be fully independent and thriving. So the story goes, allegedly, a white woman in an elevator said that a Black fella, also in the elevator, made a move on her. She got uncomfortable, as the story always goes, and this prompted intense white violence in Little Africa, to the point where the entire community was destroyed. Thousands of lives lost, the infrastructure that Black folks had built for themselves, utterly decimated. I've snooped through a couple of history books just in preparation for this, and I've not seen the Tulsa Race Riots or the Tulsa Race Massacre mentioned in a single one of them. So we're seeing the violent erasure of not only white violence against Black folks, but an erasure of even the possibility that Black communities could be financially independent. In last month's session on poverty awareness, I talk a little bit about this, how we frame a community to be down, and then we believe that that's where they belong. Another instance, less physically violent, but still ideologically very violent. Another instance of seeing Black success weaponized against Black folks is the horrible stereotype about watermelons. So I don't need to go into the stereotype. I'm sure we've all heard it. This is a stereotype that began in the early 1900s. It's not a recent one. So before its subversion in the Jim Crow era, watermelons symbolized Black self-sufficiency. Formerly enslaved Black folks started their own farms. They grew watermelons, they sold them, they made profits, much in the same way that the Little Africa thrived on its own. We're seeing Black brilliance in effect. White folks didn't like that. And so there was, I believe in 1919 as well, a terrible year if I say so myself, a postcard was mass produced that showed a young Black boy eating watermelon with some racist text over it that I shan't repeat. Southern whites used that sort of image to stereotype Black folks as being less than, and they turned the fruit into a symbol of poverty. As you all know, we don't typically eat watermelons with a fork and a knife, so this became a symbol of slovenliness and other negative things about the Black community, instead of the symbol of independence that it was, because this was a good they bartered and sold and were able to live off of, and also genuinely delicious. So we see how literal instances of violence and instances of ideological violence remove any memory, any whisper of a memory of Black self-sufficiency and Black economic growth. And instead, what we're left with are stereotypes. So if we look at the data today, we see that most minority groups make up a larger share of the homeless population than they do the general population. As you can see here, Black folks are over twice, 2.5 times represented in the homeless population than the US population. If we saw just that with no history, what might we think? Knowing that since the early 1900s and before, but also since the 1960s, there was a concerted effort on the part of media and politicians to equate Blackness with poverty. And we still see that. I often see that in really, really well-meaning allies who say, oh, we have to make our services accessible to lower income folks. And then an ally hears that and says, yes, we need Black people to access our services. They've become almost synonymous, Blackness and poverty. When they really don't have to be, they're not. Yet, because of the economic landscape that led us to where we are today, we forced Black communities into a position of poverty or less likely to accumulate wealth than their white counterparts. So it's kind of a double-edged sword here, where yes, there is overrepresentation of Black folks in poverty, but we can't ideologically equate the two because that's just stereotyping, right? We see here, and I like this kind of statistic more than the previous one because it gives us a better sense of where the money's going. This last one here, it doesn't tell you who has the houses, right? It just tells you who doesn't. But when we look about the distribution of household net worth, we can see that Black folks, which is the blue line over here, are overrepresented in those who have zero or negative household worth or lower household worth than white folks who are overly represented in having more than $1 million of household worth. So you can see the skewing of where the money did land or where the money is being earned. I used earned in scare quotes, not because I don't think people who have of affluence work for their wages. More so, I use the scare quotes to indicate that Black folks have been denied the opportunity to work for these wages or work for similar wages for many of the reasons I shared before. This, again, all of these historical facts lead to the situation that we see today, where over the past, let's just take 70 years, we see that white wealth has grown exponentially, a bit of a dip in the 2008 recession, as you can see here, but Black wealth hasn't increased. And again, those racist trolls who want to undermine Black agency and Black excellence will say, well, that's just because that's how it is. Again, that was so long ago. The GI Bill was so long ago, but we don't appreciate how the money given to white folks was able to be invested, compounded, and grow. Much like planting a tree, seeing it bloom, seeing it blossom, seeing it get those roots. That's what the finances did in some communities that wasn't able to happen in Black communities. And so we see kind of the aftershocks of that. So without that knowledge before, how might you respond to some of these facts if you didn't know America's history, if you didn't know that Black agency was denied multiple times through violence, erasure, and blame? We know that factually, 23% of Black folks raised in middle class, surpassed their parents' family wealth compared to 56% of white folks. So white folks are twice as likely to surpass their family's wealth, their parents' income bracket, than Black folks are. So we're seeing it systemic. This accounts for what that wealth is, whether that's lower income white folks, lower income Black folks, or upper income. There's still those limitations that are embedded in our system. 53% of Black folks raised in the bottom of the family income ladder remain stuck there as adults, compared with only 33% of white folks. So a third of white folks who are born into poverty will remain there, 2/3 will advance, whereas half of Black folks who are born into poverty will remain there, and only half will advance. And so you can imagine what this does to the Black psyche in terms of seeing yourself trapped, limited. What are the options? Knowing all the stereotypes, mass incarceration, the disproportionate levels of arrest, horrible representation. You can imagine the burden that takes. And lastly, for this slide, over half of Black folks, 56%, raised in the middle of the family income ladder, fall to the bottom two rungs as compared to adults. So not only are we seeing the systemic and structured denial of advancement, we're seeing by design falling. We're seeing Black folks lose the economic advantages that their parents may have earned because of the systemic oppression. Again, even a misdemeanor can result in a loss of 16% of your income. Think about how Black folks are overly policed in stores or accused of shoplifting compared to white folks. Even those little decisions, even those historical decisions, compound and lead to what we're seeing today. So, what does that mean for Black folks today? Well, children born in wealthy families, regardless of race, but we know that it's white children who are more likely to be born in wealthy families, are 6 times more likely to become wealthy adults than kids born into lower income families, and 8 times more likely to have a bachelor's degree. So we will all recall that I believe it was last year, affirmative action was removed. The idea of opening up colleges' doors to everyone having equal opportunity for an education. Apparently, we're doing that, but we're not taking into account the economic landscape while we're also erasing the fact that race plays into where one lands on that ladder. I talked a little bit about the increasing divide in the class system that we have and the increasing rate of lower income middle class, right? The top 1% of earners in the US as of last year own over 30% of the country's wealth. So again, take it back to that $4.3 billion dollars of housing that was denied, or that $1.2 trillion that enslaved Africans earned for white folks. You can see how that compounds over time. So universities like Harvard College have admitted since that they were founded on slave owner money. And again, Harvard is like the epitome of like wealth growth, academic elitism. We're still seeing the effects of that. So this continued racism and economic suppression can lead to what is called toxic inequality syndrome. And so I mentioned the emotional toll this can take on people. Is the consequences not only of everyday racism being followed through the store, persistent economic trauma, having your wages slashed through the circumstance of having been arrested for something like shoplifting, adversity, we see all the stereotyping, closed opportunity structures, that wealth ladder being inaccessible to Black folks, and exclusionary national policies like the disbanding of affirmative action. I talk a lot. So that's what results in toxic inequality syndrome. The idea that this inequality is embedded, impossible to surmount, and folks are seeing themselves trapped by it. This is where we have to talk a little bit about wealth inequality and not income inequality. When we discuss the wealth gap as just earnings and income, oftentimes it can be individualized. Of course, that single parent can't earn for their kids. They're only working in fast food or retail. Like they should get a better paying job. We talk about the individual's actions and the individual's income and earnings and their choices, limited though they may be, instead of the bigger picture that made it so that that single parent's only option or one of very few options was a lower income job as compared to a white single parent who may have an opportunity for a more white collar job than that. So we're seeing structural wealth inequality more so than income inequality. And I prefer that term again because it is more of the big picture versus the individual blames and attributions of that. So all of this is real depressing. I apologize. We have to cover a lot of the really hard things in order to figure out what we do with them. Because as uncomfortable as it is to learn about the past, folks are still living with this in the present. And we have to know it, right? Those who do not study the past are doomed to repeat it. That's why we begin always with this foundation. So I can't believe I didn't do this in earlier allyship institutes, but I wanted us to think about, as we look at the week ahead, for those of you who are joining me on Monday, and we think about the next 5 days of allyship and beyond, of course, I want you to think about the type of ally that you are. So think about it broadly, right? The information that I just shared, but also the week ahead, your sphere of influence, maybe it's your role, maybe it's your own identities. Think about the type of ally you are, because there's 7 core archetypes. And you can be each of these, all of these, a little bit of all of them. Let's decide. So the core part or archetypes of being an ally are the sponsor, the champion, the amplifier, the advocate, the scholar, the upstander, and the confidant. Let's talk about them. The sponsor. So a sponsor is an ally that vocally supports a person from a minoritized group and their work with the aim of helping boost their credibility. So if you're a sponsor as an ally, This doesn't mean necessarily giving funds and like sponsoring someone's existence, although if that's your thing, go for it, donate. This is about how you talk about Black folks, Black peers, and uplift their work when other people may be disparaging it or not noticing it, right? In many of the other trainings that we've done together so far, we talk about how like attracts like. If leadership is predominantly white, leadership will predominantly be drawn to other white folks. So, as white folks or non Black folks, boosting Black representation in positive ways, inviting them to meetings, sharing their goals, endorsing them publicly. That's one way to be an ally. Brag about your friends, especially when those friends aren't getting bragged about because of systemic racism. Another way, and this is kind of similar, but there's nuances that I hope resonate with you, and we'll stop recording and chat about them. A champion is an ally who champions for the inclusion of underrepresented groups in public avenues. So, a sponsor, you know someone in particular. A champion, you boost the message whether you know somebody or not. This is in conferences, industry wide events, meetings. So, if you're at a workplace and you're talking about accessibility, be the person who brings up the identities that aren't represented at the table, right? That's a champion. You're always advocating. There's the amplifier. So when you take on the role of an amplifier, you ensure that marginalized voices are both heard and respected. This one, I'll admit, is a little bit tricky, right? So if you're an amplifier in the workplace, let's take gender for a minute, and you notice that women are constantly being talked over and maybe having their ideas taken by men around the conference table, you would jump in and be like, no, actually, I really loved Camille's idea, even if, Darren might be taking credit for Camille's idea. You amplify the message, you boost in. Not speak for someone, not speak over someone, but amplify what they're saying. So if you have friends who are of different minoritized identities and you yourself are of privileged identities, check in with them as friends, see what you can do to amplify if they want to be amplified, right? And so this is an easy opportunity to give credit where credit is due, especially when it's not being acknowledged. There's the advocate. So this is someone that uses their power and influence to bring peers from underrepresented groups into highly exclusive circles. So let's say you are chosen for a very important focus group at work, and you notice that it's all white folks that get chosen, and you yourself might happen to be a white person. You say, actually, let's invite so and so and so and so we can get their perspectives. Not tokenizing, but inviting them into spaces where they can be heard. You recognize omissions. You recognize when barriers are put before Black folks and other folks of color or folks of different gender identities, different abilities, and you say, hey, we don't need that barrier. Like, let's bring in more people. This is a mindset of abundance. This is a mindset of sharing. So again, I'm encouraging you to think about what resonates or what doesn't resonate. There's the scholar. Hint, hint, y'all are doing this today. This is when an ally tries to learn as much as possible about the challenges and prejudices, as well as the successes faced by different colleagues of marginalized groups. I'm going for the workplace examples here as evidenced by Better Allies or as shared by Better Allies, but you can apply these to any situation. Learn more about a place. So I'm always touched, for example, when friends know where Morocco is, my home country, or know a little bit about what's going on in like different identities of mine because it shows care. It shows a willingness to learn, to get to know one another without necessarily tokenizing or expecting me to do all the explaining. So learning what's going on, both historically and definitely present day when we think about the political landscape and the ever shifting policy landscape about race and economic racism. There's the upstander. This is probably the more quintessential image of an ally. This is an ally who doesn't sit back. This is someone who steps in. If they see harassment or discrimination happening, they say, hey, now, not okay. This is somebody who interrupts offensive jokes. This is somebody who calls out the bad behavior. Now, this doesn't mean that you necessarily need the like a foghorn approach. It can be interrupting racist behavior more gently, but is interrupting that racist behavior. So seeking clarity, asking questions, that sort of thing as well. But again, this is probably the most quintessential image of an ally that we see promoted. And then there's the confidant. This one's a little bit self-explanatory. A confidant is an ally who creates an environment that makes Black folks and other folks of minoritized identities feel free to express their needs, frustrations, challenges. One of the more damaging interpersonal things that I see happen, particularly in friendships or relationships with someone of a privileged identity and someone of a minoritized or marginalized identity, is that minoritized person saying, hey, that was racist or that was sexist back there. And their friend of privilege, maybe a white person, maybe a man, says, no, I don't think it was racism. I think like maybe they were just having a bad day. That like discrediting of a person of color's experience or a woman's experience. Um, you have to believe what people tell you, right? You have to believe that what they are experiencing is true to them. It is true in general because that is their lived experience, and we can't just brush it away. This is something that is really tricky in a Midwestern context because we're also polite, we're also nice, that we don't want to admit, like, yeah, that really was racist. You were treated really unfairly there. So to be a confidant, you have to be ready to believe the experiences. You have to avoid the temptation to say no, 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 and soothe people. I struggle with this a little bit. When somebody tells me something bad happened, I'm like, oh, it'll be okay. Will it be okay? Like sometimes we just got to listen. We can't necessarily fix. And it's important to know that when you have someone's confidence, especially somebody who has experienced persecution in any way, shape, or form, that's a huge level of trust. And you want to honor that. And you don't want to go saying, hey, guess what? She thinks you're racist. Like you want to make sure that you're following that person's lead. So these are the allyship action. These are the allyship archetypes that I encourage y'all to think about. I'm going to stop recording in just a little minute. So folks at home, please consider what resonates with you. I would love an email for folks telling me what's going on, like what resonates most with them. But for my friends who are here now, I'm going to stop recording. We're going to have a little chat.